So I am a co-founder of a place called the Workshop School, which is a public project-based high school located in West Philadelphia. We're part of the School District of Philadelphia. And when I was listening to Autumn's talk just now, and particularly this idea of teenagers pushing our ideas about what activism is, about what identity is, I found myself asking a question that I've been asking for 10, 15 years now, which is whenever I hear about young people doing super awesome stuff, why can't that be school? Right? Why is that having to always happen on the margins? And so we started the Workshop School to try and begin to provide an answer to that question. Now it's June, and what that means for me is that in 2 weeks, our first cohort of seniors is going to graduate, which is very, very exciting. Yeah, applaud them. But because I'm me, it also means that it's the NBA Finals. I think a lot about high school innovation. I think a lot about my students. I think a lot about my family. And I think way too much about basketball. And so I'm preparing for this talk, and I'm thinking about the work, and I'm reflecting on how we got here, especially with this first cohort graduating, and I'm thinking about basketball, and these things are winding together in my head. And so when I ultimately came to the point of thinking about what lessons might I share, what takeaways might I have from doing this work all these years, I landed on the Philadelphia 76ers. Now, I'm a Philadelphian. I've been a Sixers fan all my life. I remember 1983 like it was yesterday. That was the last time we actually won anything for those who aren't from here. I remember 2001, oddly enough, the same year the No Child Left Behind Act passed. The Sixers were really good and went to the finals, the Allen Iverson era. And since then, the Sixers have been mostly mediocre. Not good enough to contend, sneak into the playoffs, miss the playoffs, just kind of in the middle and stuck there and unable to get out of that rut of mediocrity. That to me is what a lot of high school is. Stuck in a rut of mediocrity that we cannot get out of. And so when I started thinking about how might I frame some of these lessons learned, I started thinking about what the Sixers have done over the past few years, which A, involves lots of losing, and we'll talk about that briefly, but it also involves actually trying to do something radically different. And so there are actually, oddly enough, some lessons from that experiment that are really applicable to anybody who wants to be a change agent in high schools, in basketball, or otherwise. First, we're going to do a little bit of background. That dude in the center is Simon Hauger. The guy on the right is Michael Clapper. Those are two of my co-founders at the Workshop. We all met working at West Philadelphia High School in the late 1990s. They were both teachers fairly early in their careers. I was running after-school and adult education programs in the building and beginning to slog my way through a doctorate. And we connected pretty quickly and had a lot of conversations about what was wrong with the contemporary high school. And it really centered on a couple of things. One, students didn't see the work that they were doing as relevant. If you wanted to get a kid to care about what you were doing in class, you had to build a really strong relationship with the kid and then kind of trade on that relationship in order to get them to buy into learning about the War of 1812 or the quadratic formula or whatever the standard said you had to teach that week. And the second thing was that all of the real student engagement was happening on the margins. So you'd have kids who would come in at 6:30 in the morning for choir practice and then cut school the rest of the day. Or you'd have kids, like in Simon's after-school automotive program, who may or may not have been train wrecks during their regular classes, but were doing high-level engineering work in the afternoon, right? And so again, why can't we make that school was one of these questions that kind of stuck with all of us. Eventually, we shifted from talking about what was wrong with school to what might be right about school, and that was where the idea for the Workshop School came to be. Now, I'd love to tell you that we just hatched this idea and everyone thought it was awesome and we were off and running. We pitched this thing for a good 4 or 5 years. We couldn't get anybody to fund it. We couldn't get anybody to let us start a school. We talked a lot about democratic student-centered education back then, and it turns out district administrators generally are made deeply uncomfortable by the idea of kids running schools, and so that didn't go over all that well. So we learned we had to sneak that in. You can't front-load the democratic student-centered part. You gotta kind of work that in the back end. And so after a while of not being successful, we tried something different. We backed up. we went to the district and we said, all right, instead of starting a full high school, what if we ran an alternative senior year program? Now, one of the hallmarks of No Child Left Behind is that all of the school accountability for high schools landed in 11th grade. And so the dirty secret was nobody really knew what to do with 12th graders. It was like, all right, they're tested. We put all the resources into the 11th grade. They're going to keep showing up, right? Like, you're going to drop out. You would have done it already. They're going to keep coming. So I think the district was like, we're asking for 30 kids. They're like, couldn't hurt, right? We raised our own money for it, so we didn't ask them to fund it. And we took these 30 kids from South Philadelphia High School, Furness High School, which is also in South Philly, and West. And for 2 years, we had these cohorts of seniors who, instead of doing the typical senior year routine at their home schools, would spend it with us. And we had them design and carry out these projects that were trying to take on and solve real-world problems. In particular, in this program, we focused on kind of sustainability and green technology issues. So we had kids doing things like designing and building hybrid-powered cars. This is one of the ones that Simon and his students have built that got a lot of attention. And we had another team, this is from our second year, that designed and built off-grid modular housing that could be packed into a shipping container, deployed anywhere in the world in the wake of a natural disaster, and then assembled in 2 days on site. They used Haiti as their test case after the earthquake. And one of the things that they learned was that these are places that don't have a lot of resources, don't have a lot of working infrastructure, and billions of dollars of aid are pouring into the country after this horrible disaster, and it's all going into these temporary shelters that don't change anything in the long term. So what if you could take that money and instead deploy a whole bunch of these things, and suddenly you have housing that can hold a family of 4 and that has a renewable source of energy and sanitation and water, and so you're laying down an infrastructure. This is our kids who hatched this idea. It's our kids who drew the CAD drawings and the animations. It's our kids who wrote the business plan. It's our kids who got to go down and pitch this idea at Johnson Space Center at the finals of the Conrad Spirit of Innovation Awards. So this was the kind of thing, and ultimately, it's our kids who got to build a prototype of it at Bartram's Garden in Southwest Philadelphia. So we had a lot of successes in those first couple of years, and it was also a real blessing because we got to work out the model on a very, very small scale. We didn't have to think big questions about, like, how do you run a high school? It was just 2 teachers, 30 kids. What's the teaching going to look like? What's the learning going to look like? What's the assessment going to look like? We had time to work our way into having a school. The second important thing that happened was that we got to show people this model and not just talk to them about it. Talking to them about it was really unsuccessful. But when suddenly the superintendent or the chair of the School Reform Commission or a journalist or a funder or a filmmaker could come down and hang out and talk to our kids and see the work, it changed everything almost overnight. And suddenly people could kind of wrap their heads around this idea that, oh, you really could create a high school that's not organized by subject, for instance. You really could create a high school where kids design their own projects and where the work is supposed to get outside of the classroom. So that led us here to the workshop school. That's our front door. We're near 48th and Walnut in West Philly. And the school is designed around 3 pretty simple ideas. Community first. That is the first principle for a good reason. Most of the work that we are doing with our students involves building a healthy, strong community where kids respect each other, where they respect the work, where they can struggle, where they can make mistakes, and where they can see that what they're doing is real. We can't get to any serious, rigorous academic project work if we don't attend to this first. Second, the work is the work. The addendum to this is there are no makeup packets. Our kids, by the time they get to us in 9th grade, are experts at playing school. There's a whole skill set that involves just passing classes or how to tilt a grade from an 89 to a 91. And the incentives are all structured around the performance of those things. What does it look like to ask questions about how is your work changing the world around you? How do you rethink success? A long time ago, one of Simon's students gave a talk on a stage similar to this, and he talked about his final assessment working on a car was that if the brakes don't work, his teacher dies, right? That's a performance assessment, right? That's authentic, isn't it? And so the idea that you are accountable for the work, you are responsible for the work, but the work also has real-world implications. And then finally, persist and improve. For a couple of years, this third principle was make the most out of failure. I actually kind of like that one better, but that's another one that we learned just doesn't go over well with district leadership. It turns out they think failure is bad. And so we had to learn, same idea, but you got to reframe it in a more positive way. We've had a pretty good run so far. Plenty of struggles, but a lot of cool work coming out of our first 4 years. Huge range of projects that we run. So John here is standing in front of a mural that his class painted as part of a classroom redesign project. Most of our classes have redesigned their rooms multiple times over the years. So the conversation is, what should learning look and feel like in this space? And then they can do everything from repaint the room to design and build furniture, rearrange, get rid of stuff, add stuff, based on their ideas about what learning could or should look like. At his feet is a model our kids designed and built for a neighborhood solar collective. So this is about how do you build out neighborhood-based infrastructure to share solar energy. So they built these models, they researched the feasibility of them, and they presented them to Mayor Canny and Council President Clark last year. Every year our 9th grade class writes, produces, stages, markets a play. The 9th grade play was last night for this year. It was awesome, it was hilarious, it was based on A Midsummer Night's Dream. I loved every minute of it. 2 years ago, our students started a peer mediation program. The idea was if students could learn how to mediate conflict with and among each other, a lot of that conflict wouldn't escalate to the points where adults had to be involved. And we'd see a lot less fighting and a lot less violence, although we haven't had a whole lot of either of those things. But a lot of things that could become big conflicts could remain smaller or be solved. So half the students were trained as peer mediators, and the other half actually designed and built the room in our school where the mediations are. The school's really small, and we don't have a lot of space, and so anytime we need more space for something, we have to subdivide the spaces more. So we've had like 3 different student construction projects now to carve more spaces out of the existing footprint of our building. Students are continuing to get trained for this every year, and we're now at a place where our kids actually request mediations of their fellow peers when there are things that are starting to go wrong or concerns that they have. And the car work has continued too. So this blue car here is called the 818. It is powered by biodiesel fuel that our students make themselves with waste vegetable oil from Federal Donuts. A couple of years ago, it smells great, seriously. And full disclaimer, I don't know a thing about cars. None of this is Simon and those students' thing. I don't want to claim any credit for this part, but it is really awesome work that they continue to do. A couple years ago, this car got invited along with our students and with Simon down to the White House Maker Faire, and so some of our guys got to meet President Obama, which was pretty cool. So we've had a lot of exciting stuff happen. We've learned a lot. We've had a lot of successes. What lessons might I share based on this experience? And here we bring it back to the Sixers. That sad-looking guy there is Sam Hinkie. He was the general manager of the 76ers for 3 years. And in the admittedly superficial world of basketball, he is indeed a change agent. He's one of these people who thinks very, very differently about how the world works. And so his job was to get the Sixers from being mediocre to being excellent. Doing that involved a bunch of things. One, it involved losing lots of games. The reason is that the way basketball works is if you do not acquire elite top-level talent, you will never contend. And there's only a couple ways to do that. And the biggest one is being able to draft great players out of college. The best way to do that is to lose a bunch of games. Right? So he said, we are going to do that at all costs. We are going to maximize our opportunity for doing that. But he also did something really interesting, which is he said, we understand that we are super fallible as human beings. We make all kinds of assumptions about how decisions will play out that turn out to be wrong. And so we have to bring a lot of humility to this process. We have to increase the probability that we will be successful, even if our first 5 strategies are wrong. And so a lot of the decisions he made in running the team were based not just on like, how do I unearth that one gem somewhere, but what if the first 6 places I look for that gem turn out to not work out? I need to have place number 7 waiting for me. Right? So this was unorthodox, and it was criticized, and a lot of the media didn't like it, and a lot of the fans didn't like it, and most importantly, the NBA didn't like it. And so finally, they kind of nudged the Sixers ownership and said, you guys can't keep doing this, right? One thing led to another. Ultimately, at the end of his 3rd year, Hinkie resigned. And in resigning, he wrote this letter. Has anyone read the letter? Yeah, so the letter is 13 pages long, and it's mostly not about basketball. It's mostly about thinking, and it quotes psychologists and investors and this huge range of people. And some of the things that he wrote in that letter and things that I have read when I was looking at it are so directly relevant to the work that I'm trying to do, the work that we're trying to do, that I was kind of laughing that these two sides of my life sort of converge so neatly. So for example, he talked about the importance of disruption. He talked about the importance of doing things that have a fundamentally different goal or aim than most folks, right? So for us, what that means is school reform since 2001 has been organized around primarily increasing student scores on standardized tests, right? So what's wrong with that? What's wrong with it is that while this research base is growing and it is not ironclad at this point, it turns out, A, when you ask employers what they want in the workforce, nobody says kids who are good at taking tests. Nobody even says kids who know the quadratic formula. What they want is this stuff. They want creativity and problem solving, right? They want interpersonal skills. And the more longitudinal research we see about what kids succeed when they get out into college or out into the workforce, the list of skills also doesn't involve traditional academic contact as measured by tests. It's around things like problem solving. It's around grit. It's around mindset, right? Think about what our schools are organized. What opportunities do kids have to build these skills? What are schools really trying to teach? So why, if these are the things that matter, why are schools constrained so much to traditional test scores? So here, Hinkie talked a lot about the idea of going with things you can control, going with things that are certain. If you decide you're going to try to do something different, like assess students' performance on skills like collaboration and problem solving and not emphasize reading and math, you're going to be in a situation where you're having to figure out as you go along. You're going to be living in a world of maybes. There's no great playbook for me to understand how do I effectively teach some of the skills that I value the most in our school. So you have to get comfortable with a certain degree of ambiguity. And finally, quoting Jeff Bezos, he talked about success at Amazon is often the result of something that happened years before, not something that happened that quarter. School reform right now is way too concerned with year-to-year variation in these small metrics, in these test scores. Very often, the work I may or my teachers might do with a 9th grader won't necessarily bear fruit until that kid is in 10th grade or 11th grade. You may have 25 frustrating conversations with a student and you feel like you're not getting anywhere. Right? But one of our teachers last summer during our professional development said something, and it has stuck with me ever since. He said, "I'm not trying to be friends with my student now. I'm trying to be friends with the student they will become in 10 years. So those are the lessons that I've learned from doing this work. Know who you are, have your principles. So for us, community first, work is the work, persist and improve. Hold to those principles, live by them, be willing to repeat them. Trust each other. You are going to go through tough times. You're going to go through setbacks. Don't overreact, don't overcorrect, don't regress to the mean. And remember to always take the long view, that very often the work you're doing today will not necessarily show benefits until further down the road than you may think. Thank you very much.